You are now listening to the Unscripted Ohio Podcast, brought to you by Buckeye Grove. For all the latest Buckeyes news, analysis, reaction, and the best Ohio State community on the entire internet, head over to BuckeyeGrove.com or follow us on Twitter at Ohio State Rivals. Without any further delay, it's time to get unscripted, broadcasting from Podcast Central, a place that is not his mother's basement.
Hey, Ma! We get some meatloaf!
We promise. Here's your host, Kyle Lamb.
Hey, Ma! The meatloaf!
Welcome back, one and all, to the Unscripted Ohio Podcast for January the 21st. Good Monday, everybody. I am your host, Kyle Lamb, and it is a privilege to be playing with you tonight. Well, anyway, my terrible British accent aside, it is actually great to be back with you. It's been a great weekend of football. I was blown away by the Sunday NFL playoffs, and that was a lot more enjoyable watching that than seeing the Buckeyes basketball team drop their fourth game in a row on Friday night. I actually watched that on DVR. Maybe it's just me. Maybe I'm the problem. I must be a bad luck right now because the last three games I have not seen live, and by maybe no coincidence at all, they have lost the last three games. We will talk a little bit later, though, about what is going on with the Ohio State basketball team, because this is really, this is concerning, right? You're probably watching this team and saying to yourself now, I wonder if this is an NCAA tournament team. I mean, it should be. But they're not playing like one, and if they don't start winning soon against a very, very tough schedule, they are going to find themselves on the wrong side of the bubble on Selection Sunday. But I do want to talk about the NFL playoffs for a few minutes, and the reason being is because I think, in a way, what happened on Sunday with the AFC and NFC championships, I think they should be a referendum on the college football playoff, and I will explain that. Ohio State did, by the way, have some transfer news that I want to get into here in a little bit later in the show, because Brian Snead is leaving the program and going to be transferring, as well as Keandre Jones, linebacker Keandre Jones, who was on the 2 deep last year at outside linebacker. Did not play a lot in the regular rotation, but he did play a lot on special teams. He has announced he is entering the portal. That dreaded portal, we don't know where it comes out at, but when players go in, it's a tough time getting out of there. Keandre Jones, though, will be also departing the program. Neither one of these are significant losses for Ohio State. Brian Snead, of course, showed a great amount of potential at running back last year, but I think the Buckeyes are a little bit deep. They're plenty deep at running back with J.K. Dobbins and Master Teague, and then the guys that coming in with Steel Chambers and Marcus Crowley. I don't think there's a lot to worry about at the running back position. They are a little bit thin right now at linebacker, but I will get into that a little bit later. Keandre Jones, I think, is a bigger loss than Snead just because of the numbers, but I will talk about that later. So I'm going to bounce back now. The NFL playoffs. First of all, what can you say about the New England Patriots? So many people have tried to bury this team this year, and this is not the first year this has happened. I mean, the last couple of years, really, the Patriots have been, not inspiring all during the regular season, and some people have written them off. Not everybody, but Tom Brady is the greatest quarterback of all time, probably maybe even the greatest player of all time, and it's really amazing because, look, there were concerns and still are concerns about this Patriots team. Rob Gronkowski is a shell of his former self. He just doesn't have the ability that he once had. Those receivers they don't gain separation, and so many times against the Chiefs they drop passes that should have been first downs. And the Patriots in those last couple of drives, it was amazing what they really did in overtime and regulation, because Tom Brady had to convert on so many third downs, and it was only because receivers were dropping the ball in the first place as to why they had to convert those. But Tom Brady is amazing. And the Patriots once again pull it out, and they are going to the Super Bowl to play the Rams. A pair of great games. Next time you hear somebody, if it's next year, if you hear somebody burying the Patriots because they're only 5-3 or 6-3 or 7-3 or something like that, please do yourself a favor and smack that person, because we have seen this song and dance before. As long as Tom Brady is the quarterback, as long as Bill Belichick is the coach, do not bury the New England Patriots prematurely. They do have issues. Like I said, the receivers are very average. They don't gain a lot of separation. They're just not great playmakers. And Gronkowski is a shell of his former self. So it's not that they don't have issues, but as long as Tom Brady is the quarterback, they can get past those issues, especially with, I thought the defense played really well for the Patriots. So anyway, long story short, as this is, primarily an Ohio State themed podcast, where am I going with this? Well, this isn't heading in the direction of an Ohio State conversation, but as I said, there's something that stood out to me this weekend about the NFL playoffs that I think is really germane to why a college football playoff, I think, should expand to 8 teams. And I'm not hung up on the number 8 necessarily. Like, 4 in itself does not bother me if they stayed at 4. But what does bother me and what I do want to see is better selection in those 4 teams if that's the system that we go with. And, Stuart Mandel, and I jokingly poked fun of him on Twitter Sunday evening after the Patriots-Chiefs game. And I said, look what happens when we have a semifinal in an NFL playoff, or just a playoff in general, based on the concept of winning and earning your way there. Now, look, I'm not foolish enough to say that if we have a playoff, an 18 playoff, and we have a semifinal based on 4 winners of previous games, that it's going to guarantee 2 great semifinal games. Because we've seen in the NFL, not every NFC or AFC championship game is well played. Okay, we've had clunkers before. It's not necessarily, there's no monopoly on great games just because we have an expanded playoff system. The NFL playoffs before the semifinals have actually been very poor, very, very bad. I mean, there's been a lot of bad games in the NFL playoffs. But what happened, in my opinion, and this is why I think an 8-team expanded college football playoff, especially done correctly, I think would be very, very good for the sport, because what happened is the teams that earned their way to the semifinal, the teams that were playing well, and in this case, the Rams, the Saints, the Patriots, and the Chiefs have been the 4 best teams most of the year. I know the Patriots have not necessarily been in that group, those class of 4 teams. The Patriots kind of stick out like a sore thumb because they did not play well all year long. But the Patriots have been through the song and dance before. So that's one of the reasons why people have made a mistake killing them off. It's because they can go through the motions and they know when to turn it on. And they usually do. But these are the 4 teams I think we thought should be there and would give us the best games. And sure enough, for the first time in NFL history, we had both conference championship games go to overtime. But what I like about this is those were the 4 teams that should have been there, and I think that's why we had 2 really high-level competitive games on Sunday afternoon. And I want to see this in college football because what I think has happened, partially because of poor selections, partially because there's this indecision of, are we taking the best teams? Are we taking the most deserving teams? Are we trying to find a middle ground and take, a compromise? I think that's where we are at in college football. And, you got to understand, too, because it's a 14 playoff, we still have a long layoff. Now, the layoff is not as long or as pronounced as it was back in the BCS championship game days. Because you remember, there were a couple years where we had 6 or 7 week layoff for, like, Ohio State. I think in 2007, when they were in that game, I think there was 7 weeks from the time they played their final game against Michigan to the time they actually played in the BCS title game against LSU. 7 weeks. Now, that's not as pronounced now, okay? We have 3 or 4 weeks in between the Big Ten championship or conference title games in general for any conference and when they play the semifinals. So that time frame, between games has really shrunk, and that helps a little bit. But you still have teams that have a 3 or 4 week layoff. And with that layoff, if they weren't playing well at the beginning, maybe it's because, like Notre Dame, they're in there because they're supposedly deserving. You've got a situation where Notre Dame wasn't playing well to begin with, and then they have a long layoff, and they played a really good Clemson team, and look what happened. And Oklahoma had been up and down, a little shaky. Now they probably earned their way in, but with that layoff and playing Alabama, they certainly did not look very good. Ohio State, meanwhile, was playing its best football at the end of the year. Another reason why I would argue Ohio State should be in, but we won't go down that road again today. But what I'm saying, so if we go to a situation where we have an expanded 18 playoff, what happens then? You only have about 2 weeks in between the conference title game and the semifinal, or the quarterfinal, I should say. And then you have another 7 to 10 days between the quarterfinal and the semifinal, with 7 to 10 days, probably 10 days between the semifinal and the national championship game. So what you're doing is you're doing a couple of things. Number one, you're decreasing the amount of time in between games, so there's less of a chance for rust. You're also making it to where the teams that are playing in the semifinal games are teams that have won a game, are guaranteed to have won at least one game previously, and probably if they won the conference title games, at least 2, maybe 3 in a row. So you're getting teams that are playing in a semifinal game that are probably hot, or at least playing fairly well leading up to that game. And I think that's why college football would be so much better off by going to this system, because you're going to have teams that are playing well, and you're going to have less of a layoff. So, look, I'm not going – this isn't a hot take. The NFL playoff, just because we had 2 great games in the NFL playoff, it doesn't guarantee great semifinal games every year for the NFL, and it wouldn't guarantee it for college football if that's the route that we go. But I think that there is a lesson to be learned here. I think part of the problem for college football and why we're having terrible semifinals are all the reasons that I just mentioned. I think it's the layoff. I think it's the selection of teams, which I think has been quite honestly poor. Alabama, look, at least last year, Alabama getting in over Ohio State, I mean, you can argue at least Alabama was playing better than Ohio State for periods of the end of the year, but they went into the playoff having lost to Alabama or to Auburn. So were they really playing better? I don't know. I mean, that's a really highly subjective debate right there. But I think in general, I think the lack of transparency and the lack of decision as to whether we're taking the best teams or the most deserving teams, that creates some problems here, some problems with selection, and the selection creates problems with the matchups, and the matchups, of course, yield some poor results. So I can't blame it all on the selection. I can't blame it all on the format, but I think that these are parts of the problems, and so they should be also part of the solution. So I do think that what we saw in the NFL playoff, I was thinking about this, seeing these great games, and I was thinking it's just, the Saints and the Rams and the Chiefs and to a lesser degree the Patriots, but the Patriots turned it on in the playoff time. These are teams that got there, and we got great matchups because the good teams, the best teams, were allowed to play their way through and had momentum going into these games. Like I said, it's not a guarantee. It's not going to happen every year. If we go to an 18 playoff, we're going to have some clunkers in the semifinals. You're just not guaranteed great games all the time. But I think it would be a step in the right direction. So 2 great NFL games for the first time in NFL history. Both championships go into overtime. And I think that this is a microcosm of the problem in college football. I think it is a referendum on why there needs to be an 18 playoff in college football. As long as it's structured in a way where teams earn their way in, are playing well going in, and we minimize the subjectivity of the college football playoff committee, then I think we have ourselves a winner as far as that goes. Okay, so Ohio State, I mentioned this earlier. 2 transfers to note here this week. Brian Snead, the big running back, looked really good in the first couple games of the season and then got himself into some hot water, was in the doghouse, did not play the rest of the year. He will be leaving the program. It has not been confirmed. In his release on Twitter, it did sound like he was pushed out, and I think from all accounts, most insiders, I know, people that I talk to believe he was in fact pushed out, and that's the way his release reads. He doesn't come out and say it, but you could kind of tell this was not his decision. So Brian Snead will be moving on. Let's start with that because I want to get to the Keandre Jones thing. Look, as far as running back is concerned, next year, J.K. Dobbins is the guy. Okay, we all know that with Mike Weber off to the NFL. It is time for J.K. Dobbins to shine. Now, he took a little bit of a step back this year after all of the impressive runs and big plays we saw from Dobbins as a freshman. He was pretty disappointing, I thought, this year. Wouldn't you agree? When you look at the expectations, and it's not all his fault. Some of this was the line. Some of it was not having the run option by JT Barrett at quarterback. Haskins not having that RPO or especially the read option ability. That hurt the running backs a little bit too. It wasn't just Dobbins. I think Dobbins, like Weber, was playing a little bit hobbled for some of the year, and I think that hurt his production as well. But when you look at what Dobbins did as a freshman, I think we could all agree that he was a little bit of a disappointment as a sophomore. He was still effective. He was still a good running back, but he did not show the big play bursts that we saw as a freshman. But he is still the guy going into his junior year. There's no doubt about that. With Justin Fields likely taking over quarterback, they should be really good in the pass game. I'm expecting the line to pick up where they left off in the pass protection. But the run game has got to get better. Dobbins has got to be more consistent. He's got to hit the big plays, and they have got to get a consistent push up front in the run game. So we know from the top, he's the guy. Now, it would have been interesting if Brian Snead were still here in the program, but I got to say, I like Master Teague better. I mean, if you look at the two, Master Teague ran in similar attempts through the first 3-4 games. Master Teague actually ran for like 2-3 yards more a carry than did Brian Snead. And that's not to say Snead was not impressive, but I really like Teague. I think, especially considering he was coming off major surgery, his senior year of high school, I think you add in his talent to coming off of surgery, looking at him long term, I always felt Teague was the guy that's really going to shine down the line. Okay. So I think when you throw in then Steel Chambers and Marcus Crowley, the guy who was committed to the University of Miami and then flipped to Ohio State. By the way, if you have not done so, go watch Marcus Crowley's highlights, because you sit there, scratch your head and say, how is this guy only a 3-star? Mark Gibler talked about it when he was watching his high school Trinity. Mark Gibler was talking about watching this guy, and he really stood out to him when he saw him, and this was before he knew anything about him. So Mark was really blown away the first time he saw him in person. But just watching the highlights myself, I watched Crowley run the ball, and I've seen a lot of good running backs, and Crowley has got a chance, I think, to be up there with them. I mean, Ohio State has churned out so many great backs, and I like Crowley's potential a lot. So I'm not worried about the running back depth. It is disappointment to see Brian Snead out the door because he had some potential. But I think when you add in Master Teague behind Dobbins, throw in Crowley and Chambers, and whoever else Ohio State may pick up in the next couple classes, there's no concern there at running back depth. They've got 4 guys that are very talented. Snead, it's unfortunate. Circumstances didn't work out, but, I hate to say this about a guy that's so clearly talented, but Ohio State's not going to miss a beat here, okay? This is just a victim of circumstance, sure, but there's plenty of depth here, plenty of talent at that position. You're going to forget about this, next year. That's just the way life goes. And that's why it's good to be king, right? It's good to be Ohio State, because sometimes you can afford guys moving on like this. Now, I think the Keandre Jones situation is a little bit different just because, look, I'm sure if Malik Harrison had gone off to the NFL, maybe this is a different discussion. Maybe Jones winds up returning to Ohio State. But I do think that Ohio State has a chance to have guys step up. Remember, waiting in the wings, they've got Dallas Gant. They've got Kayvon Pope, who Greg Schiano spoke glaringly about in bowl preparations. He mentioned him on several occasions. So I think they really like where Kayvon Pope's coming from. Dallas Gant, they've got Cade Stover coming in. They've got some guys on the outside that could step into a role this year. The only problem is, with Dante Booker leaving, they're kind of thin, and they lack guys with experience. So that is a concern. But with Al Washington coming in, Greg Madison coming in, I think the linebacker still could be a strong position of strength, a real position of strength next year. Um, a lot of people want Baron Browning to take over on the inside. Terada Mitchell is waiting in the wings. Tough Borland was easy pickings as far as guys that Ohio State fans want to hate on a little bit. But there are options on the inside. The depth is a little more concerning on the outside because outside of Harrison and Pete Werner, there aren't any guys on the Ohio State roster coming back that have really been having their feet to the fire so far, and so to speak, as far as experience is concerned. So that'll be a position to watch. I do think Keandre Jones hurts them in the short term because the depth there is a little tricky. There's plenty of talent. There's plenty of 4-star and 5-star guys waiting in the wings, but that will be an interesting position. I still think the linebackers are going to be really good this year. I really do. I think the incoming coaching staff, they've got their work cut out for them, certainly, with depth and also getting guys to play with consistency. So Keandre Jones, I think, is a little bit more of a concern right now. Brian Snead, I would not worry about. But it'll be interesting. Keep an eye on those guys. Like I said, it's not a matter of lack of talent. There's some guys waiting in the wings, whether it's Pope or Mitchell, or Cade Stover. I don't expect Stover to step in as a freshman or Dallas Gant, but there are some guys there that could step up and into a really key 2-deep role for the Buckeyes this season. But that's my thought on that. So hey, real quick. So last episode of the podcast, I kind of mentioned in discussing the Tate Martell stuff. I was talking about the transfers and why I did not like the rules to be changed, and I decided to not go down this path until this episode because I wanted to spend a few minutes on it, and I had already been going on and on and on and on about it. So I mentioned that I did not think Tate Martell should get a waiver, but I thought he should be eligible, and I want to expand on that for a few minutes. Not so much in Tate Martell, but I want to look at it from a student-athlete standpoint because here's where I'm coming from this. I know people do not want free agency in college football, and I get that. But here's the thing. I mentioned this. This was my key point on this. Division III athletes, Division II athletes, athletes in all but 5 sports at the Division I NCAA level, okay? And those 5 sports being football, men and women's basketball, baseball, hockey. Okay, besides those 5 sports, every other varsity sport at the Division I level has what's called a one-time transfer exception. And that basically means that if you are an athlete transferring to another school, regardless of the level, you have an opportunity to play right away. You have an exception to what's called the year in residence rule, which means you have to spend 1 year on campus of the new institution before you're eligible in your sport. But if you are an athlete in any one of those other 35, 36, 37 varsity sports that have championships, or if you're at a Division II or Division III level, you don't have to sit out, okay? And that means you get a one-time transfer exception. The first time you transfer, as long as you're on track to graduate and you are eligible at the time of transferring, you do not have to spend a year in residence before you're eligible. That means you could take off at the end of the year, go to a new institution, and you're immediately eligible in that next semester, okay? This is why I want this to apply across the board. I don't think football players or basketball players, just because they're talented at the Division I level, I don't think they should be treated any differently. And I know some people will argue, well, that's a good reason why they shouldn't be paid, and that's fair. Although I would argue that I think the free market should determine that. I actually am not in favor necessarily of paying players per se, but I am in favor of football players and basketball players having the ability to profit off of their likeness. So not necessarily paying them a salary as much as letting them go make money off of their name. I think that should be afforded them an opportunity. But in general, though, I think that should be available to every single athlete. And that's not treating them any different because basically it's allowing the market to dictate whether any athlete should be able to profit off their name. Michael Phelps, back when he was a swimmer at Michigan, if he was good enough to profit off of his likeness when he was a swimmer at Michigan, I think he should have been able to do that. And that should be afforded to a football player, a basketball player, a tennis player, a swimmer, you name it. And so I want every single athlete to have the opportunity to transfer. If you're a musician and you want to transfer programs and participate in a music program, you don't have to sit out. If you're a tennis player and you want to go play tennis at another institution, you don't have to sit out. And I want that for college football players and college basketball players. I know some would argue, well, free agency this, free agency that. But honestly, I don't think it's as big of an issue. The transfer portal, I think, is blowing things out of proportion a little bit. I think you're hearing a lot more in the media, and it makes it seem like free agency is almost here. But really, the waivers were only issued this past year. Waivers have been around for a while, and they've only been issued to something like 8 to 10% of basketball and football players. Or I'm sorry, they've only been requested by about 8 to 10% of college football and basketball players. And they've only been granted to about 30 to 35%. So we're not really at this point where it's it's just like being blown wide open. Okay, this is really nothing new. You're just hearing a lot more about it. The portal. I do believe it's causing a few more players to seek a transfer because it allows them an opportunity to go talk to teams without getting the permission granted by their schools. Because remember, that's the only difference now, is that you can go into the portal and you can talk to anybody you want. It used to be that schools had to give you permission as to who you could talk to. And that's the big difference right now with the portal. But you could already do that if you were an athlete at other institutions, or at least you could transfer with the one-time exception. And so that's my hope for where this goes. Graduate transfers, I think, are good microcosm as to how this might work out. Graduate transfers have a higher rate of transfer than regular transfers do, but it's like 25, 26, 27% as opposed to 18 to 20% in college basketball and college football already. So we're only talking about a difference of maybe 5, 6, 7, 8%. Okay? Really not a lot of difference between what we've seen the past several years. Guys are already transferring at a pretty high rate. So I know this portal, I know not everybody likes it, but I think philosophically, I think it's the right thing to do. Let them transfer without penalty. Coaches can go bail anytime they want. Other athletes at the rest of these institutions can already transfer whenever they want. Let these guys be afforded the same opportunity. I know maybe as a fan it sucks, but we shouldn't be doing things based on what us fans want. I mean, honestly, we shouldn't be selfish. It's not our lives. I think we should allow the athletes a chance. Give them the same opportunities Joe athlete at the Olympic sport level has. They had the opportunity to transfer, so give the football and basketball players a chance to transfer. Let them have free market earnings. I know that's a different discussion. I'm not saying pay them. I'm just saying let them have free market earnings. Let them dictate their own earnings potential. That's just my thought. I think that would be a good next step after we get this taken care of. But I think we're heading down this path. I really do. I think that these waivers are going to get to the point where they're subjective, and eventually common sense is going to prevail, because it's like, if we're going to let them transfer anyway, let's just institute the one-time transfer exception and get rid of the subjectivity of the waivers. There's no reason to say, well, we'll let this guy transfer, but not this guy. So when I said, I didn't think Tate Martell, based on the existing rules, should be allowed to transfer, I'm also issuing the caveat, I do think he should be able to transfer like every other athlete at Division II, Division III, or the Olympic sports in Division I. I just like to see us do away with the subjective waivers. Let guys transfer one time if they're eligible and on track to graduate. The second time, you have to sit out. And by the way, one other caveat I will issue. I want guys to be able to transfer without sitting out, but you have to finish the academic year. I don't think it should be midseason. So if you're a college basketball player, I don't think you should be able to jump ship in December, in the middle of the season, and then be immediately eligible at your next institution. I do think you should have to wait until the end of the year before you are granted eligibility. Just my thoughts on that. If you'd like to discuss that, I would love to hear your thoughts on the transfer rules and all that. Hit me up on Twitter at KYLam8. Would love to have this discussion about where this is heading with college football and college basketball.
Stretch runtime here at Unscripted Ohio. Kick up your feet as we cross the finish line with the Buckeye Beat. the latest in Ohio State news and notes.
Kick the tires and light the fires, Big Daddy.
I'm going to wrap this up with some Buckeye basketball talk here. I'm not going to sugarcoat anything. It's getting close to time to panic. 4-game losing streak, losses to Rutgers, Iowa, Maryland. Look, Maryland's playing really good basketball. They've got one loss in the conference. They're number 19 in the country. You can handle that. Despite it being a home loss, you can handle the loss. It's not a terrible loss. Even road losses at Rutgers and Iowa, not embarrassing. Because this league just doesn't have a truly bad team in it. So it's not so much the teams are losing to, but the fact is they're not playing good basketball right now. They're really not. And this league, the problem is it doesn't get much easier. I mean, it never gets easier. There are some winnable games here on the schedule, but they've got to really get back on track because they're playing a Purdue team that's playing better suddenly. Then they go to Nebraska. The Purdue game is on Wednesday. They've got at Nebraska on Saturday. They've got at Michigan, who finally lost to Wisconsin this past weekend. Then home games against Rutgers and Penn State. They've got to win those games. Okay, these Purdue, Rutgers, Penn State games, they have to win at home. There's just no way around that. Games at Indiana, Illinois at home, then at Michigan State, Northwestern, at Maryland, Iowa, at Purdue, at Northwestern, and Wisconsin to wrap up the Big Ten. There are some wins in there if they can get things back on track. But the problem is the way they're playing right now, none of these games are givens. And that's the issue. They are so out of sync right now offensively, and it has, I think, impacted their defense because they're not playing shutdown defense like they were early in the year. They're not playing well right now on either side of the ball. Look, this is just my opinion. I trust Chris Holtmann and his staff to do what they think is in the best interests of the Ohio State basketball team. But for me, I'm kind of teetering on the idea that maybe it's time to really get some more time to the young players. And that's not like a build for next year approach. I actually am not looking at it that way. I know some people are saying, well, it's just time to get the young guys some time and worry about next year. I don't think it's time to do that yet because I think this is still an NCAA tournament team if they can get things together. But I think they've got to look at the bright side here and the upside. And right now I think C.J. Jackson and Keyshawn Woods, two senior guards that are very talented but have just been very erratic. I think maybe that they are just not capable of handling all the they're not shouldering the burden like they should be. And there's been some flashes here in a few games. Justin Ahrens has played a little bit more, and he's showed a few things. Dwayne Washington, of course, we know his talent. Luther Muhammad is really struggling offensively. Nobody expected him to come in and be the dog right away on the offensive side of the ball. But he shows the ability. I think you got to get the ball in the hands of these guys. Andre Wesson has been struggling a little bit inconsistently. His offensive game is what it is. It's limited. Musa Jallow shows some flashes here and there. I just think it's time to rely more on the young players, not because it's time to just forget this season and build for next year. I'm not looking at it that way. But I think if these are the guys, the talented players of the future, I think it's time to trust them and just hope that they can provide a spark for this team to turn it around. There's plenty of time to do that, okay? Ohio State is 12-5 right now. They don't have any bad losses as far as showing up on their profile sheet. The way the NCAA tournament committee looks at this at the end of the year, they don't have any bad losses right now. That's the good news. But they do need to start winning, and there's going to be an opportunity for good wins. I mean, like I look at all the road games that I listed that would be quality wins. Nebraska, Michigan, Indiana, Michigan State, Maryland, Purdue, Northwestern, and then a couple games at home. It's interesting. Most of their tough games are on the road, which it's kind of a catch-22. It's an opportunity for great wins, but it's also more of a likelihood for losses. The only tough games, the toughest games that Ohio State has at home are Wisconsin and Iowa and Northwestern. And a couple of those may or may not be tournament teams. Iowa's kind of in the middle. Northwestern right now not looking like a tournament team, more like an NIT team. Wisconsin is probably a tournament team. So anyway, it's do or die time for Ohio State. They got to get this turned around really quickly or it can get out of hand. And I think this 3-game stretch here that they have coming up, Purdue, at Nebraska, at Michigan, is going to tell us a lot about where this team stands. Because if they can win 2 or 3 of those games, I think they'll be back on track and be really good shape for the NCAA tournament. But if they lose these 3 or 2 out of 3, who knows how the season will finish. They could find themselves in a precarious position really quickly. So Ohio State basketball back in action, 7 p.m. on Wednesday against Purdue at home. And then on Saturday on FS1 at noon, they are on the road at Nebraska. So critical stretch for the Ohio State basketball team, who has found itself in the middle of a 4-game losing streak. Can Chris Holtmann get things rectified and turned around here before the end of the year? We will soon find out. That is going to do it for the Unscripted Ohio podcast. Of course, you can catch us every Monday and Friday on BuckeyeGrove.com. You can also catch us on SoundCloud, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, and Spotify. Coming up Wednesday, Corey and Johnny will be back at you with the Scarlet and Great podcast. And I think on Friday we are looking at doing a little bit of a group effort. I'm not 100% sure on this, but I believe Corey, Johnny, and I will probably be back on Friday for the next edition of the Unscripted Ohio. So stay tuned for that, but you can catch us normal time. You can catch them on Wednesday. Catch me again on Friday, one way or the other. Of course, you can always tweet at me at KYLam8. I would be very appreciative of that. Anyhow, that is going to do it. Hope everybody has a great week. We'll catch you again on Friday. Go Bucs.
You can get new episodes of Unscripted Ohio on Mondays and Fridays exclusively at BuckeyeGrove.com or anytime on SoundCloud, iTunes, Google Play, or Stitcher. Be sure to subscribe to stay up to date on all things Ohio State.